There is something in your home right now that most people will never even think to question, not because it is hidden in a dramatic or frightening way, but because modern life has trained you to ignore the invisible entirely. And that is precisely where the danger lies. Because in Catholic understanding, the unseen world is not symbolic or poetic language. It is real, structured, and constantly active around your life, whether you acknowledge it or not. What you are about to hear is not speculation, and it is not meant to create fear. It is meant to restore a kind of spiritual awareness that has been slowly lost. Because according to centuries of Catholic tradition, confirmed through Scripture and the consistent witness of the saints, every human life is surrounded by an invisible order that is more present than the physical world we rely on every day. Angels are not abstract ideas or devotional images. They are intelligent, created spirits, older than the material universe itself, and assigned by God to assist in the guidance and protection of human souls. The striking part is not that angels exist, but that most people live as though they do not. The result is a kind of spiritual blindness, where real protection is active but not recognized. Real guidance is offered but not noticed, and real warnings are given but often ignored. Over time, this creates homes and lives that feel spiritually empty, even when nothing outwardly appears wrong. Catholic teaching, especially as reflected in passages like the Gospel of Matthew, affirms that guardian angels are not symbolic figures. Christ himself speaks of their angels, who always behold the face of the Father. That detail matters because it means the guardian angel is never disconnected from God, even when the human soul becomes distracted or distant. The connection upward remains constant, even when awareness downward fades. This is where most people misunderstand the spiritual life. They assume that if God or angels are present, it should automatically feel obvious or emotionally powerful. But the tradition is much more precise. The presence of an angel does not depend on emotional perception. It depends on spiritual conditions. And those conditions can either allow angelic assistance to operate clearly, or they can make it feel almost silent in the background of daily life. Now, when we speak about a guardian in Catholic theology, we are not speaking about a passive observer. We are speaking about a personal, spiritual intelligence assigned to a soul with a mission of guidance, protection, and interior prompting toward good. But that mission is not experienced in the same way in every life. Some people live with a strong sense of interior clarity, moral awareness, and unexpected protection. Others feel spiritually confused, disconnected, or constantly internally distracted. The question is not whether the angel is present. The Church is clear that the guardian angel does not abandon the soul. The real question is whether the conditions of a person's life, particularly the spiritual condition of their home and habits, allow that angelic assistance to be fully received and recognized. This distinction is extremely important, because it shifts the entire conversation away from fear and toward responsibility. The angel is not absent, but the clarity of its action can be obstructed, not because it stops working, but because the human side of the relationship becomes spiritually closed off through neglect, disorder, or the absence of interior openness. Throughout the mystical tradition of the Church, saints and spiritual writers repeatedly describe angelic influence not as something mechanically identical in every situation, but as something responsive in its expression. The angel remains constant, but the degree to which its guidance is perceived or effective in shaping a life can vary based on the interior state of the person and the spiritual atmosphere of their environment. This is why two homes can look identical on the outside, yet feel completely different in their interior atmosphere. One may carry a sense of stability, clarity, and quiet strength even in difficulty. Another may feel restless, emotionally tense, or spiritually fragmented even when nothing obvious is wrong. The difference, according to the tradition, is not random. It reflects the quality of spiritual openness within the life of that household. And this leads to a deeper point that most modern thinking struggles to accept. The spiritual environment of a home is not neutral. It is formed over time by choices, habits, prayer, moral life, and openness or resistance to grace. In that environment, the guardian angel is either able to act with clarity and strength, or its activity becomes less noticeable, not because it withdraws, but because the conditions are not aligned with its mission. This is not meant to suggest that God is withholding protection. Catholic theology is very clear that God does not abandon the soul. Instead, it is more accurate to understand this in terms of spiritual receptivity. Just as light can fill a room, but still be blocked from entering a closed space, so too the activity of grace and angelic assistance can be present, but not fully experienced when interior conditions are not open. So the real question begins here. What does it actually look like when angelic presence is active and unobstructed in a home? How would you recognize it not in theory, but in daily life? The tradition offers three key signs, not emotional impressions, not vague feelings, but observable patterns that reflect whether the guardian angel is able to operate freely within the life of a person or a family. These signs are not extraordinary miracles. They are subtle, consistent, and deeply human. The first and most foundational sign is a certain kind of peace, not a temporary calm based on circumstances, but a deeper stability that remains even when life itself is unstable. This is where we begin, because if this foundation is missing, the rest becomes much harder to recognize. The first sign is this, a kind of peace that does not behave like normal peace. It does not depend on external conditions, and it does not disappear every time life becomes difficult. It sits underneath the surface of a person's life, like something steady and unshaken, even when everything above it is unstable. To understand this properly, you have to separate emotional calm from spiritual peace. Emotional calm is fragile. It changes with money, health, relationships, and daily stress. But the peace described in the Catholic tradition is different. It is not produced by circumstances, which means circumstances cannot fully destroy it either. It persists even when the mind is under pressure. This is why Scripture describes it as something that surpasses understanding. That phrase is not poetic exaggeration. It is a precise theological claim. It means this peace cannot be explained using normal psychological or environmental causes. It comes from a deeper source, which the tradition identifies as proximity to God through grace and the ministry of spiritual beings who remain constantly oriented toward Him. In a home where the guardian angel is able to act freely, this peace becomes part of the atmosphere. It is not always loud or emotionally intense. In fact, it is often quiet, but it is consistent. People notice that even during conflict, something in the background of the home does not fully collapse into chaos. You can see this most clearly in how families respond to difficulty. Two families can go through the same crisis, but the internal experience can be completely different. One enters panic, fragmentation, and constant anxiety. The other still suffers, still struggles, but does not completely lose its center. There is a stability that remains, even if only faintly. The tradition explains this by saying that angels, especially guardian angels, participate in divine peace and communicate something of it to the soul they are assigned to. St. Thomas Aquinas describes this not as direct transmission of divine essence, but as a secondary participation. In simpler terms, the angel does not replace God's peace, but helps orient the soul toward it in a stable way. However, and this is where the diagnosis becomes important, this peace is not experienced equally in every home, even though every person still has a guardian angel. The difference is not in whether the angel exists, but in whether the environment allows its influence to be recognized and received without obstruction. One of the most consistent causes of obstruction described in the tradition is the loss of interior order. This does not always mean dramatic sin or obvious moral collapse. Often it is more subtle. It is the gradual replacement of prayer with distraction, reflection with noise, and awareness with constant stimulation. When a home becomes filled with noise, not just physical noise, but mental and digital noise, the interior space required to perceive spiritual peace becomes crowded. The angel is still present, but its influence is no longer the most noticeable reality in the environment. This is why many people experience what can only be described as restless homes. Nothing is visibly wrong, but nothing feels fully settled either. Conversations are easily agitated, patience is thin, and even in moments of rest, the mind does not fully quiet down. From a spiritual perspective, this is not random. It reflects a lack of interior openness to the deeper peace that is being offered. Now, it is important to avoid misunderstanding this point. The absence of peace does not automatically mean spiritual failure or divine rejection. Catholic theology is careful here. It recognizes that human psychology, trauma, stress, and physical conditions all play real roles in emotional experience. Not every lack of peace is spiritual in origin, but the tradition also insists that there is a deeper layer beneath psychological experience. And at that level, peace is not just a feeling, but a kind of spiritual stability rooted in grace. When that layer is active, it remains present even when the emotional layer is disturbed. This is why saints were often described as having peace in situations that would normally produce fear or panic. It was not because they were emotionally unaffected, but because something deeper in them was anchored. That anchoring is what the tradition associates with life in grace and the unobstructed assistance of the guardian angel. In practical terms, this first sign becomes a question of pattern rather than moment. No home is perfectly peaceful all the time. That is not the standard. The question is whether, over time, the baseline of the home returns to a place of interior stability or to a place of constant agitation. If the characteristic return state of a household is anxiety, irritation, restlessness, or unresolved tension, that is spiritually meaningful data in the language of the tradition. It does not immediately diagnose anything extreme, but it does indicate that something in the spiritual environment is not functioning as it should. Now we move to the second sign, which is more subtle but often more revealing, an interior awareness of moral reality before actions take place, not just after. Most people understand conscience as something that reacts after a decision is made. It produces guilt, reflection, or regret. But in classical Catholic thought, conscience is not only retrospective, it is also anticipatory. It warns before the act, not only after it. This anticipatory dimension is where the tradition places the influence of the guardian angel in a very specific way. The angel does not typically communicate in words or external messages. Instead, it works through what theologians describe as interior illumination. This means the mind receives a movement toward clarity, hesitation, or recognition that something is not aligned with good. From the person's perspective, this does not feel like an external voice. It feels like their own awareness becoming sharper for a moment. A situation that seemed acceptable suddenly feels questionable. A choice that seemed harmless suddenly carries weight. A direction that seemed normal suddenly produces resistance inside. This is not random intuition in the psychological sense. The tradition is careful to distinguish natural instinct from spiritual prompting. Natural instinct can be influenced by fear, memory, or bias. Spiritual prompting, when properly formed, is oriented toward moral clarity and ultimately toward God. The challenge is that this faculty can be strengthened or weakened over time. It is not static. Just as physical sensitivity can be dulled through repeated exposure, interior moral sensitivity can also be reduced through repeated disregard. Every time a person ignores an interior warning, not dramatically, but consistently in small decisions, the threshold of sensitivity shifts slightly. Over time, what once felt clearly wrong begins to feel normal. What once created hesitation begins to feel neutral. This is not immediate. It is gradual, which is why it is often unnoticed. In a home context, this becomes even more significant because households form shared patterns of sensitivity. Children learn not only from instruction, but from the emotional and moral reactions they observe. If a home consistently treats interior discomfort as something to override rather than to examine, that pattern becomes part of the family culture. In contrast, in homes where interior awareness is taken seriously, something different develops. People begin to pause before decisions. They begin to name internal discomfort without immediately dismissing it. They begin to treat conscience not as an obstacle to desire, but as information that deserves attention. This is where the guardian angel's influence becomes most visible in daily life. Not in dramatic events, but in small moments of hesitation, reflection, and redirection that prevent greater disorder later on. Saints describe this as a kind of continuous interior guidance that does not overpower free will, but works alongside it. The angel does not force decisions. It clarifies them. It brings attention back to what matters when the mind begins to drift away. In homes where this second sign is active, you often see a shared language of awareness. People say things like, "Something doesn't feel right," or "I need to think about this more," and those statements are taken seriously rather than dismissed. That is not psychological anxiety. That is moral sensitivity still functioning. In homes where this sign is weakened, decisions are often made quickly, without interior reflection, and only later evaluated through consequences. The loss is not just moral, but perceptual. The ability to detect moral weight in real time becomes diminished. This leads naturally into the third sign, which builds on both peace and moral awareness, the pattern of protection that becomes visible only over time. But before moving there, it is important to recognize what has already been established. The first two signs are not mystical phenomena reserved for extraordinary individuals. They are ordinary features of a spiritually ordered life, and their presence or absence tells you something concrete about the interior condition of a home. The third sign moves the discussion outward, from what is felt internally to what can be observed in the unfolding of daily life. It is the pattern of protection that becomes visible only when you look at time as a whole rather than isolated moments. Most people evaluate their lives event by event. Something happens and they interpret it as good or bad based on immediate impact. But the Catholic tradition invites a different way of seeing. It suggests that providence is often only recognizable retrospectively, when multiple events are viewed together and a pattern begins to emerge. This is where the guardian angel's work becomes especially important, because its ministry is not limited to interior guidance or moral prompting. It also includes what theology calls participation in divine providence. In simpler terms, the angel is involved in guiding, redirecting, and protecting the circumstances of a person's life in ways that are not always obvious in the moment. This does not mean life becomes free from difficulty. In fact, the tradition is very clear that suffering, challenge, and uncertainty remain part of human existence. But what it does mean is that within those experiences, there can be a hidden structure of guidance that only becomes visible when you step back far enough to see the larger shape. This is why Scripture often presents angelic action in narrative form rather than isolated incidents. In the book of Tobit, for example, the angel Raphael does not appear as a single dramatic intervention. Instead, he accompanies, guides, arranges, and coordinates events in such a way that only at the end does the full meaning of his presence become clear to the people involved. That pattern is extremely important for understanding how angelic protection typically works. It is rarely about stopping all difficulties. It is more often about shaping outcomes through a series of subtle adjustments that preserve the soul, redirect danger, or prevent consequences that would have been spiritually damaging even if they were not immediately visible as such. In lived experience, this often appears as what people casually call luck or good timing. But within the tradition, these are not random. They are interpreted as moments where divine providence, often mediated through the guardian angel, has arranged circumstances in a way that protects or guides the person without violating their freedom. For example, a person may miss a bus, only to later discover that the bus they missed was involved in an accident, or someone may feel an unexplained hesitation about a decision that later proves to have serious negative consequences. These moments, taken individually, can be dismissed as coincidence. But over time, patterns begin to form. A key point here is that the tradition does not encourage superstition or obsessive interpretation of every small event. Not every delay, interruption, or change of plan is spiritually significant. But it does suggest that when a person or a family is living in a state of prayer, grace, and openness to God, a pattern of meaningful protection becomes more recognizable over time. This recognition depends heavily on attentiveness. Without reflection, life feels fragmented. Events appear disconnected, but with reflection, especially when combined with prayer, gratitude, and regular examination of one's day, a different picture begins to emerge. You start to notice not just what happened, but what was avoided. Not just what went wrong, but what could have gone worse. This shift in perception is crucial. Many people only measure divine action by visible blessings or dramatic interventions. But the tradition encourages a broader view that includes unseen protection, avoided harm, and redirected paths that only make sense in hindsight. In homes where the guardian angel's influence is more consciously acknowledged, this pattern is often actively named. Families will point out moments where something could have gone differently, or where they don't know why, but something stopped them, or where the timing felt unusual in a good way. Over time, these observations form a kind of spiritual memory within the household. That memory is important because it strengthens trust. When a family begins to recognize patterns of protection, they become more capable of trusting in moments of uncertainty. They are less likely to assume abandonment during difficulty because their experience has shown them that difficulty is not the end of the story. Now, the absence of this recognition does not mean protection is not occurring. According to the tradition, the guardian angel is always active. The difference lies in perception. A person who never reflects on their life in a spiritual way may miss entirely the pattern that is actually present. This is why the practice of examination is so central in Catholic spirituality. The daily reflection on one's experiences is not just a moral exercise, it is also a perceptual training. It teaches the mind to recognize meaning in what would otherwise be dismissed as randomness. When this practice is absent, life becomes flattened. Events lose their depth. Everything is reduced to surface-level interpretation. But when it is present, even ordinary days begin to reveal layers of meaning that were not initially visible. The guardian angel's role in this context is not to force recognition, but to shape circumstances in such a way that, over time, the attentive soul can begin to see a pattern of care. This care is not always protective in the sense of preventing all hardship. Sometimes it is protective in the sense of ensuring that hardship does not destroy what is most important within the soul. This brings us to a subtle but essential point. Protection in the Catholic sense is not the same as comfort. A protected life is not necessarily an easy life. It is a guided life, and guidance sometimes includes permitting certain difficulties while preventing deeper spiritual harm that would be far more damaging. This distinction is important because it prevents misunderstanding of what the third sign actually indicates. The presence of a protection pattern does not mean a life without suffering. It means a life in which suffering does not have the final word, and in which even difficult events are integrated into a larger trajectory of growth, correction, or preservation. Saints often reflect this reality in their writings. Many of them experienced intense suffering, yet consistently interpreted their lives as being guided. Not because their circumstances were easy, but because they could see, over time, how certain events had prevented greater loss or led them toward deeper spiritual clarity. This perspective is only possible when reflection is combined with faith. Without faith, the same events can be interpreted as meaningless coincidence. With faith, they become part of a narrative of providence that includes both visible and invisible dimensions. In practical terms, the third sign becomes clearer when a person begins to ask specific questions about their past. Not just what happened to me, but what was prevented, what was redirected, and what changed direction without my control, but ended up protecting me in ways I only understand now. These questions slowly reshape how a person views their own history. Instead of seeing life as a series of disconnected events, they begin to see it as a guided process, even when the guidance was not obvious at the time. In homes where this awareness is present, gratitude becomes more natural. Not forced gratitude, but recognition-based gratitude. People are not just thankful for what they received, but for what they were spared. This type of gratitude is one of the clearest indicators of perceived providential care in Catholic spiritual life. At the same time, it is important not to reduce this to emotional interpretation alone. The tradition does not ask people to imagine patterns that are not there. It invites them to observe carefully, reflect honestly, and remain open to the possibility that their life is being guided in ways that exceed their immediate understanding. This openness is key, because without it, the third sign cannot be perceived even if it is fully present. The pattern exists objectively in the flow of providence, but it is only recognized by a mind that is willing to interpret life through the lens of divine care rather than pure randomness. This brings us to the deeper implication of all three signs taken together. The atmosphere of peace, the moral awareness, and the pattern of protection are not separate phenomena. They are interconnected expressions of the same underlying reality, a life that is open to grace and actively engaged with the invisible order of God's providence through the ministry of the guardian angel. Once you begin to recognize these three signs together, something important shifts in how you understand your own life. It stops being a collection of random emotional states and disconnected events, and starts to look more like a structured spiritual reality that either allows or obstructs something already present. And that something, in Catholic understanding, is not vague energy or abstract symbolism, but a real network of grace, providence, and angelic assistance working toward the good of the soul. At this point, the question naturally changes. It is no longer only, do these signs exist, but if they are missing, what has interrupted them? Because the tradition is very clear on one point that often gets overlooked in modern discussions. The guardian angel does not stop working. The variation is not in the angel's fidelity, but in the condition of the human life it is assigned to. This is where we enter the question of restoration, not as theory, but as practical spiritual reconstruction. If a home lacks the peace described in the first sign, or the moral sensitivity of the second, or the recognizable pattern of protection in the third, the tradition does not leave that situation as permanent or hopeless. Instead, it outlines very concrete conditions under which the flow of grace becomes clearer again. The first and most fundamental element is the restoration of sanctifying grace through the sacrament of confession. This is not presented as one spiritual tool among many, but as the foundational restoration of the soul's connection to God. In Catholic theology, sanctifying grace is what makes the soul capable of receiving divine life. When that is lost, the interior channels through which spiritual clarity flows become obstructed. Confession, then, is not only about forgiveness in a psychological sense. It is about re-establishing the spiritual state in which the guardian angel's influence can be fully operative. When a soul returns to grace after a serious break, many people describe a noticeable interior shift. Not necessarily emotional intensity, but a kind of clarity, stability, and renewed sensitivity to spiritual reality. This aligns with what many spiritual writers and confessors have observed over centuries. People often report that after a sincere confession, their conscience feels more awake, their prayer feels less blocked, and their ability to reflect on life becomes clearer. In the language of the tradition, this is not just emotional relief. It is the reopening of a spiritual channel that had been partially closed. However, confession alone is not presented as the entire structure of restoration. It is the foundation, but not the full architecture. Once the soul is returned to grace, the next step is the establishment of a stable rhythm of prayer in daily life. Without this, the restored clarity often remains unstable or fades again under the pressure of ordinary life. Daily prayer in this context is not limited to occasional moments of turning to God in difficulty. It refers to a consistent structure that shapes the rhythm of the day. Morning offering, evening examination, family prayer, and devotional practices like the Rosary are not treated as optional enhancements, but as stabilizing practices that keep the soul oriented toward the invisible order it belongs to. When this rhythm is missing, life tends to become dominated by external stimuli. Work, entertainment, stress, and distraction fill the interior space that would otherwise be occupied by reflection and awareness of God. Over time, this leads to what can be described as spiritual forgetfulness, not rejection of faith, but practical absence of it in lived awareness. In homes where daily prayer is restored, something noticeable often happens gradually. The atmosphere begins to shift. Conversations become less reactive. Decisions take on more reflection, and the sense of interior fragmentation begins to reduce. This is not immediate transformation, but steady reordering. Alongside prayer, the tradition emphasizes the importance of sacramentals as a physical extension of spiritual reality into the home. Holy water, crucifixes, blessed images, and other sacramentals are not treated as decorative objects. They are understood as consecrated matter participating in the sanctification of space. The logic here is deeply incarnational. Catholic theology consistently affirms that grace does not bypass the physical world, but works through it. Just as the sacraments use material elements like water, oil, and bread as instruments of grace, sacramentals extend that principle into the daily environment of the home. When a home is visibly ordered in this way, it becomes a space that constantly reminds the inhabitants of spiritual reality. Not in an intrusive or obsessive manner, but in a quiet, stable way that reinforces awareness of God's presence. This reinforcement, over time, supports the conditions in which the guardian angel's influence is more easily recognized. Another essential element of restoration is the recovery of spiritual attentiveness. This is perhaps the most subtle, but also one of the most transformative aspects of the entire process. It refers to the habit of noticing what is happening internally and externally through a spiritual lens rather than purely a psychological or practical one. In practical terms, this often begins with something very simple: reflection at the end of the day, not as a formal exercise, but as a habit of asking where grace was present, where hesitation occurred, where decisions were influenced by something deeper than immediate preference, and where protection might have been experienced without being recognized at the time. Over time, this practice reshapes perception. It trains the mind to see patterns rather than isolated events, meaning, rather than randomness, guidance rather than chaos. This is where the third sign becomes increasingly visible again. What once seemed like coincidence begins to take on structure when viewed through consistent reflection. In families where this attentiveness is cultivated together, the effect is even stronger. Children begin to learn that their interior experiences matter, that their conscience is real, and that their lives are not disconnected from spiritual reality. They begin to develop a language for discussing inner movements, not just external events. This shared awareness becomes a kind of spiritual ecosystem within the home. It supports the angelic mission not by changing the angel, but by making the human environment more receptive to what is already being offered. At the same time, the tradition is careful not to reduce everything to technique. Restoration is not simply the result of following steps mechanically. It involves disposition, humility, and openness. A person can perform all external practices without interior engagement and still remain spiritually disconnected. This is why the emphasis is always on sincerity rather than perfection. The goal is not flawless execution of spiritual disciplines, but genuine reorientation toward God and willingness to see life differently. The smallest authentic step in that direction is considered significant within the tradition. As these elements begin to work together, confession, prayer, sacramentals, attentiveness, a gradual rebalancing takes place. The signs described earlier begin to reappear, often quietly at first. A moment of unexpected peace in a difficult situation, a sudden moral clarity before a decision, a realization, in hindsight, that something harmful was avoided without clear explanation at the time. These are not treated as isolated experiences, but as indications that the underlying spiritual structure is becoming more coherent again. The guardian angel, which was never absent, becomes more perceptible, not because it has changed its activity, but because the conditions of reception have changed. There is also an important psychological dimension to this restoration process that the tradition does not ignore. As spiritual clarity returns, anxiety often decreases, not because problems disappear, but because they are no longer experienced in isolation from meaning. The sense that life is random or unstructured begins to weaken. This shift has profound effects on decision-making, relationships, and internal stability. A person who believes their life is being guided, even through difficulty, does not experience hardship in the same fragmented way as someone who believes everything is accidental or meaningless. However, the tradition also warns against expecting immediate or dramatic results. Restoration is typically gradual. The re-establishment of spiritual sensitivity takes time, especially if it has been weakened over long periods. Just as physical senses can become dull and require time to recover, interior perception also requires consistent renewal. What matters most is not intensity but consistency. Small, faithful actions repeated over time are what rebuild the conditions in which grace and angelic assistance are most clearly experienced. In the next and final section, the focus will shift to integration, what it means to live with sustained awareness of this invisible order in ordinary daily life, and how the recognition of these signs changes not only perception, but the way a person or family moves through the world. In the final stage of this reflection, everything begins to come together into a single question that is no longer theoretical, but deeply personal. If these signs are real, and if they reflect an underlying spiritual structure that is already present in every human life, then the real issue is not whether they exist in principle. The real issue is whether we are living in awareness of them or in practical forgetfulness of them. Because according to the Catholic tradition we have been tracing, the invisible world is not distant. It is not separate from daily life. It is not something that occasionally interrupts normal existence through rare mystical events. It is the background reality in which normal existence already takes place. The problem is not absence. The problem is perception. When perception is restored, even ordinary life begins to look different. Not in a dramatic or exaggerated sense, but in a subtle reordering of meaning. Events that once felt random begin to reveal direction. Interior movements that were once ignored begin to carry weight. Moments of peace that were once dismissed as coincidence begin to be recognized as signs of something deeper at work. At the center of this awareness is the understanding that the guardian angel is not a symbolic idea, but a personal, continuous presence assigned by God to each soul. This presence does not fluctuate based on human awareness. It remains constant. What changes is whether the person or household is living in a way that allows that presence to be experienced as active, guiding, and perceptible. This is where the entire discussion becomes practical rather than abstract. Because if the angel is always present, then the difference between spiritual clarity and spiritual confusion is not about whether something is there, but about whether the conditions of life are aligned with what is already there. Living with this awareness changes the way a person approaches everyday decisions. Instead of treating life as a sequence of isolated choices, everything begins to carry a sense of continuity. Small decisions are no longer seen as insignificant, because they are part of a larger pattern of formation. Interior movements are no longer dismissed automatically, because they may be part of a guiding structure that has been consistently active over time. In this way, discernment becomes less about searching for extraordinary signs and more about learning to recognize the ordinary signs that have been present all along. A moment of hesitation before a decision, a sudden clarity about a relationship, a quiet sense of peace in a situation that would normally produce anxiety. These are no longer treated as psychological noise, but as meaningful data within a spiritual framework. At the same time, this awareness brings a certain seriousness to how life is lived. Not a fearful seriousness, but a responsible one. Because if life is being guided, then it also means life is being observed in a deeper sense. Not in a punitive way, but in a way that reflects the dignity of being personally accompanied in existence. This is where many people misunderstand the tradition. They assume that awareness of angels and spiritual reality leads to abstraction or detachment from ordinary life. In reality, it does the opposite. It deepens engagement with ordinary life. It makes daily actions more meaningful, not less. It increases attentiveness rather than reducing it. A person who believes they are completely alone in their decisions may treat those decisions as isolated and self-contained. But a person who believes they are accompanied by a guiding intelligence oriented toward their ultimate good begins to approach those same decisions with more reflection, more care, and more awareness of consequence. This does not remove freedom, it clarifies it. Because freedom in the Catholic sense is not the absence of influence, but the ability to choose the good with awareness of reality. And reality in this framework includes both visible and invisible dimensions working together. When this awareness enters a household, the effects are even more noticeable. A home begins to develop a kind of internal coherence, not perfection and not the absence of conflict, but a deeper sense that life is being lived within a meaningful structure rather than drifting without direction. In such homes, prayer is not an isolated activity, but part of the rhythm of life. Moral reflection is not occasional, but habitual. Moments of difficulty are not interpreted as abandonment, but as part of a larger process that is not fully visible yet. And gratitude becomes more natural, because attention is regularly drawn to what has been given and what has been protected. This is where the three signs we discussed earlier come back into focus as a unified reality. The peace that remains under pressure, the interior moral awareness that responds before action, and the pattern of protection that becomes visible over time are not separate phenomena. They are interconnected expressions of a single underlying reality, a life in which the invisible order is not ignored, but gradually integrated into awareness. And importantly, the tradition does not present this as something reserved for exceptional individuals. It is presented as the normal fruit of a life lived in grace, supported by the sacraments, sustained by prayer, and open to the presence of God working through both ordinary and spiritual means. What is striking, however, is how easily this normality can be lost without dramatic rupture. It does not usually disappear through a single event. It fades through neglect. Prayer becomes less frequent. Reflection becomes less intentional. Awareness becomes more external than internal. And over time, what was once perceptible becomes background noise again. The restoration, then, is not about discovering something new, but about recovering something that was quietly present all along. That is why the tradition emphasizes return rather than invention. Return to confession, return to prayer, return to attentiveness, return to awareness of the invisible order that was never actually absent. And here is where everything becomes very concrete, because awareness without response is incomplete. The tradition consistently insists that recognition of spiritual reality must lead to action, not as a reaction to fear, but as a response to clarity. That is why the practical steps mentioned earlier are not symbolic gestures. They are forms of reorientation. Confession restores the soul's openness to grace. Prayer restores the rhythm of relationship with God. Sacramentals restore the physical environment of the home to spiritual awareness. Attentiveness restores perception itself. Together, these create the conditions in which the three signs become more naturally visible again, not forced, not manufactured, but re-emerging as the natural expression of a reordered spiritual life. And once that begins to happen, something subtle but important changes in how life is experienced. Difficulty is still difficulty, but it is no longer empty. Uncertainty is still present, but it is no longer directionless. And silence is no longer absence, but space in which something deeper is understood to be operating. At that point, the idea of the guardian angel is no longer an abstract teaching. It becomes a lived awareness. Not constant emotional awareness, but stable intellectual and spiritual recognition that one's life is not unfolding in isolation. And that recognition changes how a person endures suffering, how they interpret delay, how they respond to moral challenge, and how they understand the meaning of their own history. Because nothing is any longer viewed as purely accidental or disconnected. Everything is held within a larger framework that includes guidance, protection, and presence. This is the final point the tradition wants to leave us with. Not fascination with the unseen world, and not anxiety about it, but integration with it. A life in which the visible and invisible are no longer treated as separate realms, but as one reality seen at different levels of depth. And in that integrated awareness, the three signs are no longer something to search for as external evidence. They become something recognized as the natural atmosphere of a life that is aligned with its spiritual reality. So the final question is simple but not superficial. It is not, do guardian angels exist? The tradition has already answered that. The question is whether your life is arranged in a way that allows you to notice what has been with you from the beginning. Because according to this understanding, nothing essential has been missing, only awareness has.